14 minutes and 45 seconds in the afternoon of June 27, 2025, a single MiG-29 banked hard against the western sky. Its worn fuselage trembled as voltage alarms burst to life, scattering red light across the pilot's visor like sparks from a dying star. What had begun as a routine flight now balanced between ingenuity and oblivion. Somewhere ahead, a Russian drone factory pulsed with quiet industry, producing the machines that would soon haunt Ukraine's night skies. Inside the cockpit, old Soviet circuits wrestled with modern American code. Every gauge, every improvised cable was a bet against failure. In war, perfection rarely wins, persistence does. The airframe itself seemed to remember another century, yet on this day it carried a message written in courage and wire. That adaptation is the soul of survival. He glanced at the valley ahead, low ridges folding into mist. Beneath him, the ground offered concealment. Above him waited radar and death. Between the two stretched a corridor of chance, a narrow place where history is made. This is not merely a mission. It is proof that in modern conflict, creativity can make even broken steel fly again. The mission order had been written in understatement. Strike target Alpha High XI, drone assembly complex, coordinates attached. Yet every line hid months of preparation and the quiet hope of a city tired of sirens. The objective lay 350 kilometers inside occupied territory, a cluster of steel hangars producing 40 Shahed-type drones each week. Each one of those drones meant another night of fire over Ukrainian homes. To reach and destroy that factory was to claw back a measure of safety for thousands who would never know his name. The aircraft itself was a contradiction. The MiG-29 of the 40th Tactical Aviation Brigade had been born in the last century, designed for an empire that no longer existed. Its bones were strong, but its heart had aged. Engineers on a freezing airbase had opened her panels like surgeons, rewiring Soviet pylons to carry American precision weapons. The result looked improbable, but functioned with the stubborn logic of battlefield necessity. Beneath each wing rested a GBU-39 small-diameter bombbow, sleek, intelligent, light enough to glide 100 kilometers from release altitude. Their systems, however, had been designed for Western aircraft, not for this veteran of another doctrine. To bridge the difference, the engineers created adapter pylons from scavenged tank parts, relays from spare circuit boards, software run through a tablet taped to the cockpit frame. Improvisation became the new definition of innovation. As dawn crews tightened the last bolts, voltage regulators hissed in protest. Soviet wiring met American ambition. Sparks of mistrust literally danced between cables. But there was no alternative. The strike package consisted of 1 aircraft, 4 bombs, and the precision of one man's judgment. The electronic symphony of radar, countermeasure, and deception would begin the moment he crossed the border. In modern warfare, progress is not measured only by what is new, but by how old things are reborn. These modern military equipment, reshaped by necessity and human ingenuity, carried not merely explosives but a statement that determination can make an antique, a weapon of the future. He adjusted his oxygen flow, checked the fuel, and traced his fingertip over the valley line on the digital map. Beyond that thin blue mark began the enemy's realm, and the next chapter of the impossible. The sky above the target was not an empty theater, it was an instrument panel of sound and silence, a struggle between signals and the void. To understand the mission, one must first understand the invisible war that preceded it, the battle for the sanctity of position, timing, and sight. On one side stood layered Soviet-era air defenses, S-300, S-400 long-range systems, agile SA-15 mobile batteries, HS designed to detect, paint, and destroy at scale. On the other, electronic warfare units, notably the Kushuka 4, broadcast a simple but devastating lie. Noise. 500-watt jamming vehicle sounds modest on paper, but in practice, it is a weather system for frequencies. The Kashuka 4 bled L1 and L2 GPS bands with sheer volume, forcing receivers to crawl through static like pedestrians through fog. For any platform relying solely on satellite navigation, that fog becomes a maze. The transcript shows how those jammers do not always need to be precise. They need only be loud and persistent. Against that, the GBU-39 is not a dumb piece of metal. Its designers anticipated the savage arithmetic of Soviet electronic doctrine. When GPS fell below acceptable signal-to-noise ratios, the bomb's guidance computer switched to inertial navigation in a fraction of a second. Inertial guidance does not know where a satellite says you are. It knows where you were and how you moved. It accumulates error, but over an 80 to 90 kilometer glide when built with hardened sensors and frequent inertial updates it can keep a weapon within scores of meters of its intended aim. Counterpointed to the jamming, Ukrainian planners staged an electronic choreography. Earlier harm strikes had temporarily blinded specific radar nodes, a surgical removal of eyes in the network, creating a narrow window for climb and release. Simultaneously, deception suites transmitted false radar returns and phantom approach vectors to pull attention away from the true ingress. In a well-timed ballet, those decoys forced operators to look the wrong way, to squander milliseconds that became a life-saving gulf. The interplay between active jamming and system resilience is a technical duel. One side throws noise at a receiver, the other hardens algorithms, uses redundant sensors, and performs graceful degradation. The GBU-39's ability to sample GPS when the signal occasionally peeked through, then fuse that correction into its inertial solution, is what turned a likely miss into a near-pinpoint strike. For the pilot, these were not abstract concepts, but hard-beat mechanics. A green light on the tablet, a momentary calm in the cockpit, and the knowledge that complex electronics were doing their quiet, vital work while he flew through the teeth of an electronic storm. For the untrained ear, flying low looks like bravado. In truth, it is geometry made flesh. Radar works by line of sight. The Earth itself becomes an ally when a pilot knows how to read its slopes. The ingress corridor the mission used was little more than an 8-kilometer seam between overlapping S-300 coverage, a narrow lane where physics, not doctrine, dictated safety. At altitude, radars extend their reach. Close to the ground, the curvature of the planet and terrain occlusion create blind pockets. The S-400 at Metatopol, for instance, simply cannot see beneath 800 feet at the distances involved. That limitation produced a corridor. Fly too high, and you invite every long-range system into your path. Fly too low, and a mobile SA-15 or an uncharted antenna becomes your executioner. The margin for error was measured in kilometers in drift, 2 kilometers left or 3 kilometers right, and the geometry changes from safe passage to lethal trap. The pilot used the valley like a lengthening handrail. Riverbeds, gullies, and ridge lines sculpted the radar horizon. A dry riverbed offered an extra 200 to 300 feet of concealment, but at the price of obstacles not shown on planning charts. Power lines, fences, and ruined pylons turned the navigation into an intimate contest between man and machine. He flew at 400 feet, sometimes lower, with fuselage scraping the spatial map only his instruments and instincts could draw. Timing was as critical as position. The operation carved out a window of approximately 90 seconds for the climb to release altitude. Enough for the weapons to glide clear, not enough for a concentrated radar network to reorient fully. That window depended on prior actions. Earlier harm strikes had silenced select emitters. Deception feeds had diverted attention, and the pilot's ascent had to be synchronized to the minute. A 4G pull to 15,000 feet had to be initiated at precisely the planned time. Any hesitation cost seconds that could not be brought back. Navigation under such conditions is a layer cake of redundancies. The tactical display tracked inertial dead reckoning, map fixes, and intermittent GPS snaps when jamming momentarily eased. The pilot cross-checked barometric altitude, ground speed, and visual cues, aging, the exact shape of a ridge, the burn scar of a field. There was no single instrument to trust. Absolutely, trust was assembled from many small confirmations. In short, the flight was choreography, a measured dance of altitude, heading, and heartbeat. Each meter held consequence, each second tightened the noose or opened the gate. When the pilot finally started the climb, he did so not with bravado, but with the calm of someone who has rehearsed 1,000 small decisions until they add up to one irrevocable motion. The moment to climb was a litmus test of timing and nerve. For minutes, the MiG had lived in the seam between detection cones, a shadow that the air defense grid could not easily touch. Now the pilot had to expose himself to every long-range eye for the sake of the weapons glide. The ascent was simple in outline and fiendish in execution, a hard 4G pull to 15,000 feet, a release sequence measured in heartbeats, and an exit plan down to the second. As he eased the stick back, the cockpit became a crucible of lights. Fire control radars that had been sleepy now woke and painted. The S-400's gravestone radar, a blunt instrument of raw power, began to track with a relentlessness that felt physical. Instruments warmed, warning tones sharpened. The pilot had exactly 90 seconds from the first solid lock to reach the launch point and clear the engagement bubble most likely to produce a missile with 24 seconds of flight time to reach him. Physics was not negotiable. The choreography relied on prior deception and surgical duels. Earlier, harm strikes had temporarily silenced a portion of the network. Spoofed radar returns had steered attention away. Those actions bought a slender window, an interval in which missiles, command latency, and human hesitation would fail to converge. The pilot's climb had to be synchronized to that window to the degree that planning margins collapsed into instinct. Arming and arming checks ran in parallel. The GBU-39 suites, after a delay earlier in the sortie, now showed green. Their embedded logic was vigilant. When GPS melted under the Kushuka 4's jamming, each weapon seamlessly transitioned into inertial navigation while waiting for fleeting satellite snapshots to correct accumulated drift. The pilot pickled the first store at precisely the planned second. There was a mechanical thump as the bomb separated, and a fraction of a second later, the winglets deployed, turning each munition from a falling body into a small, determined glider. Release was at tempo. One by one, the weapons left the aircraft at intervals engineered to saturate defenses and equus, converging from different vectors, arriving in 30-second trains to overwhelm point defenses and maximize sequential damage. As he rolled, inverted, and drove the aircraft earthwards after the last release, fire control radars slid to tracking mode and launch rails elsewhere flared with activity. Missiles launched, but their intercept geometries were now pitted against terrain masking and timing mismatches. Many would be chasing empty sky. In the cockpit, there was no exultation, only a focused inventory, fuel remaining, heading for egress, a mental count for bingo. The ascent and release were not the climax, they were a hinge. If the choreography held, the weapons would navigate the invisible storm ahead. If it failed, the pilot would be left to outrun consequences he could not correct with his hands alone. Once the weapons cleared the aircraft, the visible drama ended and a quieter, far more technical contest began. Each GBU-39 unfolded its small wings at roughly 2.7 seconds after release, transforming from a heavy bomb into a high-aspect glider with a lift-to-drag ratio near 20:1. At a typical cruise of 180 meters per second, that flight was not a fall but a measured transit of 89 kilometers through contested airspace W1, long enough for electronic storms to batter their sensors and short enough that well-designed guidance could still prevail. Inside each munition, a hardened navigator ran a constant reconciliation. The inertial measurement unit recorded accelerations and rotations. Its processors computed position updates 20 times per second. When GPS briefly peeked through Kushukafor's jamming, the weapon would sample satellite fixes and fuse those snapshots into its inertial solution. These intermittent corrections allowed the guidance to reset accumulated drift, shrinking error margins back toward the planner's required tolerance. Over the weapon's glide paths, this architecture held them within single-digit to low double-digit meter accuracy. Accuracy are the difference between a near miss and a mission success. Electronic warfare attempted to sever that chain. Continuous 500-watt jamming on the L1 and L2 bands raised noise floors and reduced signal-to-noise ratios below acceptable thresholds. Yet design choices mattered. A resilient navigation stack that could detect poor satellite geometry, degrade gracefully to inertial-only navigation, and opportunistically accept fleeting GPS corrections would not be deceived by brute force noise alone. In other words, these modern military equipment were not simple receivers. They were systems built by engineers who expected a Soviet-style problem and designed accordingly. Flight profiles were deliberately staggered. The four munitions took divergent ballistic-to-glide arcs so that they would approach the target complex from different bearings and arrive in roughly 30-second separations. That sequencing forced point defenses into choices: commit to one incoming bogey and expose another, or scatter resources and risk none being engaged effectively. Terminal seekers, in this case uncooled infrared images, searched for thermal signatures that betrayed rooflines, engine bays, and electronics workshops. Once a match exceeded a confidence threshold, final control surface commands adjusted heading and angle of attack, so the impact vector maximized penetration or disruption as planned. From a distance, each bomb's journey looked like silent inevitability. Up close, it was a nested system of fallbacks and opportunistic updates, inertial memory that refused to forget, GPS snapshots that corrected it when possible, and terminal vision that finished the job. The electronic storm was violent and relentless, but engineering and choreography turned intermittent openings into the decisive advantage the pilots and planners had been buying for with every calculated risk. The first impact unfolded not as a textbook explosion, but as a slow, fatal punctuation. At 15:32 and 44 seconds, the lead GBU-39 found the assembly hall. The bomb's uncooled infrared seeker had locked onto the roof's thermal signature, a patchwork of heated metal and sun-warmed machinery, and the final guidance vector drove it down at an oblique angle to maximize penetration. The roof gave way in a white, incandescent bloom. Structural timbers and corrugated steel folded inward. Benches, tools, and the skeletal frames of half-assembled drones were flung into a hurricane of dust and flame. Less than half a minute later, the second munition struck the electronics workshop. This was the nerve center. Benches cluttered with laptop computers, racks of programming rigs, and soldered control boards where flight control firmware was calibrated and tested. When that weapon detonated, shockwaves ripped across the room. Fragile microelectronics, the very code that turned airframes into guided weapons, vaporized under overpressure. Circuit boards shredded like paper. Delicate connectors fused or shattered. For a drone program, that room was not merely a workspace, it was a node that transformed components into operational systems. In that instant, an industrial capability was rendered inert. The third impact arrived at 15:33 and 41 seconds, striking the storage warehouse. Intelligence had assessed between 15 and 20 completed Shahed-type drones on site. Those estimates now became a grim arithmetic. A single blast among assembled munitions created sympathetic detonations, fuel tanks ruptured, electronics ignited, and a cascade of secondary explosions rolled through the depot. What had been tens of thousands of rubles in parts and months of logistical effort became incandescent ruin. The blast plume rose in a column that would later be measured at some 3,000 feet, visible for miles and carrying with it the tactical message of lost capacity. By the time the fourth weapon completed its run, the complex was no longer a coherent military node, but a smoking wound, assembly lines silenced, programming racks destroyed, warehouses gutted. The immediate operational effect was stark. A weekly output of roughly 40 attack drones was interrupted not by attrition, but by the severing of an industrial chain, from parts and assembly through to guidance testing and storage. Without the electronics workshop and programming stations, completed airframes became little more than expensive chassis, unable to convert into reliable, guided munitions. Strategically, the impact was multiplied. The loss of inventory and tooling forced a pause in launch cadence, disrupted distribution, and created an urgent logistics headache for commanders. The psychological effect was as important as the material. Watching key facilities evaporate under precise attack sapped momentum and bought time for defenders and centers of population. In the hours afterwards, analysts would note that destroying the guidance and programming nodes inflicted a systemic shock greater than simply eliminating final-stage drones, because it degraded the adversary's ability to regenerate capability quickly. For the pilot and the planners, the damage assessment was confirmation. The choreography had worked, the weapons had performed, and a complex network of production and distribution had been fractured. The cost in metal and machines would be tallied. The tactical consequence was immediate. A significant interruption to drone operations in the southern sector, brought by a single, carefully executed sortie. The moments after release were not the relief of victory so much as the start of a different, quieter contest, getting home. For all the orchestration that had sent 4 weapons downrange, the pilot still had to thread the return path through the same lattice of radar and missile cones that he had just exploited. Egress is always a negotiation with time, fuel, distance, enemy reaction, and the patience of systems designed to catch the unwary. Immediately the air lit with warning tones. Say 15 batteries, nearer to the target, launched 9 M9-point missiles as the bombs streamed toward their aims. Their intercept calculus, however, had been set against a different geometry. The missiles had the speed to close, but lacked the line of sight required to maintain track through deep ground clutter and the river valleys masking curvature. Within 45 seconds, the valley ahead promised to break radar lock. The missiles would either self-destruct or struggle into meaningless spirals after losing guidance commands. Some did launch and arc uselessly, others never achieved a clean track. Higher assets tried to intervene. Su-35 fighters were vectored from Berans to intercept the lone MiG. In theory, the fighters had range and missiles that could reach him, but theory collided with logistics, fuel state, transit time, and the geometry of a low-level target all worked in the pilot's favor. The fighters needed many minutes to reach the intercept point. By then, he would be tens of kilometers closer to safety. Their R-77 missiles had excellent reach in clear conditions, but radar acquisition of a target masked by terrain at 400 feet is notoriously difficult. The pursuit became an exercise in diminishing returns. Inside the cockpit, the pilot ran a steady checklist. He monitored fuel, H3/4 of a ton used in the ingress, a finite pool that dictated every maneuver. He kept his speed and altitude conservative enough to preserve terrain masking, yet fast enough to close the paddock of hostile airspace before fuel became critical. Missile launches flashed on his warning panel. He folded his flight path into ravines, timing turns to place ridges between his signature and hostile seekers. Each maneuver was a calculated gamble. A steeper turn might spoil a missile solution but cost altitude or speed. Too cautious and the fighters might close. As the valley swallowed him, the SA-15 batteries lost lock. Their missiles expired or self-detonated after losing guidance. The Su-35s, unable to find a reliable radar picture and constrained by fuel and transit time, peeled off. By the time the MiG crossed back into friendly airspace, the tactical display showed a clear route and an ocean of black where threats had been. He leveled at 400 feet, exhausted but composed, the adrenaline receding to a steady thrum. Post-mission analysis would later confirm what he had felt in the cockpit. The weapons had remained within 12 meters of their planned trajectories despite continuous jamming, and the choreography of egress had been as decisive as the attack itself. For the pilot, there was no fanfare ruse, only the routine of landing checks, the quiet of a man who had spent an hour shaping danger into effect. Outside, the smoke columns still climb where the complex had been. Inside, the crew debrief would turn those columns into lessons for the next sortie. War often disguises its heroes beneath overalls and soldering irons rather than medals. Behind the glamour of the sortie lay the hands that had made it possible. Technicians working through nights without heating, engineers who scavenged broken circuits from tank yards, coders who translated incompatible languages of Soviet avionics and American guidance firmware. Improvisation was not a phase of désigné, it was the design itself. Every component of the MiG had become a negotiation between past and present, between what existed and what was desperately needed. On the airbase, the pilots called the modified aircraft the hybrid. Its pylons bore American lineage, its wiring Russian ancestry, its logic Ukrainian stubbornness. Before the mission, one mechanic was heard to say, "She may not trust her own heartbeat, but shall fight." That was not poetry, it was diagnosis. When voltage regulators flared red during system checks, the ground crews did not panic. They reached for spanners, paperclips, and faith. What they produced was a testament to human refusal, a machine made of compromise that refused to behave like one. Inside the cockpit, the pilot carried more than ordnance. He carried the names of people who lived beneath the drones he was trying to stop. To him, the bombs were not symbols of aggression, but instruments of reprieve, temporary silences carved out of a sky that had long been predatory. Every light flicker, every tone from the warning receiver became a question of judgment, when to trust, when to override, when to improvise again. In those seconds, technology dissolved into instinct. What separates man from machine is not precision, but purpose. Circuits may execute without error, yet they do not comprehend consequence. The pilot, the mechanics, the planners, all of them understood the moral perimeter of what they were doing. They were not chasing statistics, they were trying to reintroduce choice into a landscape dominated by automation and attrition. Their courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to keep thinking through it. Improvisation is a quiet word, but in this theater it became synonymous with survival. Every welded joint, every handwritten correction in a checklist, every unspoken calculation in the cockpit formed a chain of ingenuity that stretched from a cold hangar to a burning target hundreds of kilometers away. In that chain lay the proof that ingenuity, discipline, and compassion can coexist even at Mach speed. Every conflict writes its own textbooks, but few lessons are as lucid as the one carved from this single sortie. Strategy is often discussed in abstractions, territory, attrition, deterrence. But beneath those terms lies a more intimate principle, adaptability. The mission over the drone factory demonstrated that adaptability is not a footnote to doctrine, it is doctrine. When equipment becomes outdated, it is human reason that restores relevance. On the technical level, the operation validated decades of Western design philosophy. Build systems that can fail gracefully, that can recover partial function when primary sensors are compromised. The GBU-39's blend of GPS, inertial, and terminal guidance turned brute force jamming into little more than static. Those who designed the bombs had prepared not for perfection but for resilience, and that foresight converted electronic chaos into tactical order. The phrase signal integrity became literal. Every heartbeat of data kept the weapon alive in a hostile spectrum. For defense planners, the sortie was a case study in hybridization. It showed that legacy airframes, when matched with creative integration, could deliver precision effects once thought the preserve of fifth-generation platforms. That insight carries economic and doctrinal weight. Nations investing in adaptability rather than exclusivity might field more survivable fleets with less capital. The lesson is not to discard the old, but to reimagine it. There lies the intersection where innovation meets necessity. At the operational tier, the mission underscored the value of timing and deception. No technology, however advanced, can compensate for poor choreography. Electronic warfare suppression, false radar returns, terrain masking, and carefully computed ascent windows all formed parts of a single sentence written in the language of coordination. When synchronized, they created seconds of asymmetry, seconds that changed the outcome of a night's work and perhaps of a campaign's tempo. Beyond the equations, the flight spoke to the enduring human element. The pilot's discipline under pressure, the technician's resourcefulness, and the planner's foresight reflected a culture of problem-solving rather than complaint. That culture is the true force multiplier. In an era fascinated by autonomy and artificial decision loops, the mission reminded strategists that human judgment remains the final and most flexible algorithm. Strategically, the sortie redefined proportionality. 4 small weapons delivered via a decades-old platform achieved an operational impact far beyond their mass. The conclusion was unavoidable. Ingenuity, when systematized, can offset quantity and even quality. In that sense, Ukraine's adaptation did not merely defend as it innovated in plain sight. War remains a brutal ledger of destruction, yet its lessons are often constructive. This mission, dissected in laboratories and classrooms, will remind future aviators that technology's edge is measured not only in bandwidth or range, but in imagination. For it is imagination that transforms instruments of survival into instruments of strategy. The valley that afternoon became both a battlefield and a blackboard. The wreckage below was brutal proof that technology, when guided by intellect and will, can rewrite what was thought impossible. Yet the mission was never about spectacle. It was about how men and machines meet halfway, how improvisation and precision can coexist without contradiction. The sortie will live in after-action reports as data points, but for those who planned and flew it, it was a statement that courage can be engineered, and engineering can be an act of faith. Every light on the pilot's console, every circuit soldered by a tired technician, every calculation scribbled in the early hours was a declaration that the spirit of invention still outruns the machinery of destruction. Across the world, analysts would debate signal losses, glide ratios, and radar horizons. Few would mention the human hand steadying the throttle or the quiet resolve that turned chaos into orchestration. History seldom rewards the unknown engineer, yet it is they who ensure that wars are fought with intelligence rather than inertia. The legacy of this flight lies not in the tons of metal it destroyed, but in the insight it restored. That adaptability and conscience must share the cockpit. In every era, new weapons promise certainty, but certainty is an illusion. The real strength of any force lies in its people, those who question, who tinker, who dare to merge the incompatible and make it work. Military equipment can embody brilliance, but brilliance fades without understanding. Military equipment can dominate a moment, but without humanity it decays into obsolescence. Military equipment, at its best, becomes an extension of intellect, a mirror held to the mind that made it. As the MiG crossed back into the quiet air of its homeland, smoke still climbed on the horizon, not a signal of vengeance, but of warning. Every generation inherits a choice, to trust machines blindly or to wield them wisely. The pilot chose the latter, and in that choice lies the essence of survival.